I guess.
Who are you talking to?
What does he think of what he sees?
Home. Getting the latest.
I'm
supposed to pick somebody up. We're having dinner tomorrow night. It's my wife's birthday and her best friend's birthday, so we're celebrating together.
I mean, it was just like in.
Yeah, getting your GED, your diploma.
Maybe.
David just gave me this.
Yeah.
I can barely explain it.
Need to pass out this sign-up sheet for alternative radio. There's a very particular condition. Are some of you old enough to remember a class in school called penmanship?
Oh, yeah.
A couple of people here remember that. Please, your name and email address, if you could write it clearly, then I can send you some information about alternative radio.
You mean print like a Roman?
Print clearly, yes.
That's all I want.
False start, but we actually are going to get started. My name is Julie, and I would like to welcome everybody, new and old, to Topanga Peace Alliance. We've been meeting now for what, Michael? 9 years? 10 years?
After.
Oh no, it's before the Afghanistan.
It'll be 10 years in November.
10 years in November.
Hey,
And our mission is expanded from a peace group to a peace and justice organization. We are dedicated to nonviolence and peaceful resolution as an alternative to war. And we understand the importance that peace and justice are linked. So we get involved in all kinds of struggles, whether it's supporting workers, whether it's supporting immigrants, whether it's supporting young people to not have to be only listening to military recruiters on their campuses. You name it, Topanga Peace Alliance is there. Women's rights, anniversary commemorating this ongoing war, and at Occupy. We've been part of Occupy LA, Occupy Venice. We're out there on the streets and really proud of that. And like our wonderful speaker tonight, most of us are really challenging capitalism. So we're very excited to have tonight with us DavidBarsamian. David is a Harlequin Clapper. He's a prize-winning journalist. He's the host of Alternative Radio, which is, many of you know it from KPFK. He's just come out with a new book called Occupy the Economy, which really confronts capitalism and talks about new models. We're very excited to have David with us tonight. Welcome, David.
Dun 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 dun. We interrupt this program from Topanga Canyon to bring you this breaking news story from TIBC, the Truth in Broadcasting Corporation, from our secret underground headquarters in Area 51 in Nevada. I'm Dick Veneer, your glib and banal anchor of Facade News. Facade News, the 24/7 newscast dedicated to keeping you in the dark. We go straight to the surface of a story, and we stay there. No one can challenge our in-shallow reporting. We're motivated by the highest standards of journalism. We deceive, you believe. Ladies and gentlemen, an amazing story coming across our news desk. According to an obscure group calling itself the Topanga Peace Alliance, they are reporting that Ben Bernanke, Hank Paulson, Alan Greenspan, Timothy Geithner, Larry Summers, Robert Rubin, and Lloyd Blankfein, and other bankers and government officials have been arrested for financial crimes against the American people. They were found in a bunker under the inn of the 7th Reich, under a huge mattress with trillions of dollars in cash, a stash of World Wrestling Federation DVDs, and Pat Boone and Barry Manilow's CDs, and scores of Papa John's pizza boxes used. They were taken into custody by a heretofore unknown group calling itself TULIF, the Topanga Liberation Front. According to Taggart, a spokesperson for this group who refused to give her first name, she said, "This action is long overdue. We're dedicated to nonviolence, but we're sick and tired of waiting for the Obama administration and the Justice Department to bring these criminals to account," her voice rising in indignation. The prisoners, wearing orange jumpsuits and shackled with black cloaks over their heads, would later reportedly to have shouted defiantly at their captors, "Do you know who we are? We are the masters of the universe. We are the lords of finance. We rule the world." And then, inexplicably, every one of them burst into tears and said, "We want our mommies." If convicted, they will do time in Guantanamo. You'll remember the infamous U.S. prison that was returned to Cuban sovereignty on Christmas Day 2012. It looks like curtains for the former masters of the universe. Their heads were bowed as they were led away by blue-helmeted peacekeepers of TULIF, the Topanga Liberation Front. Headed by Commander Elith, who would not give her last name. I'm Dick Veneer, your still glib and banal anchor of Facade News, the 24/7 newscast dedicated to keeping you in the dark. Remember, we deceive, you believe. You either watch our news or you will be watched. And now back to our regularly scheduled broadcast in the library in Topanga. Well, good evening, Topanga. It's great to see you here. I mean, you're missing the presidential debates. I think, isn't there one on tonight? Is there a playoff game tonight? Is there nothing? Nothing. Not the World Series yet? Anyway, it's great to be here. I've never been in Topanga. This is the, and I'm talking about, having spoken in Cairo, Damascus, Aleppo, Beirut, Istanbul, Tehran, New Delhi, Bombay, Calcutta, and now Topanga. I haven't missed the beat. This is the last stop of a blitz tour of Southern California. I spoke at Ventura Community College yesterday afternoon, and in Dick Nixon's Whittier last night. Yes, and I was thinking about that. If Nixon were alive today, how he would be viewed as probably the last liberal president of the United States. That's how far the political spectrum has shifted in this country to the right. And I mean that about Nixon only in terms of his domestic policy. In terms of his foreign policy, of course, he is a dyed-in-the-wool imperialist, an aggressor, and a certifiable war criminal. But when you think about, the Freedom of Information Act, the creation of the EPA, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, I mean, all of these things, the creation of OSHA to protect workers, this was all done under the Nixon administration. He even had the audacity to suggest to Congress that every single American should have a guaranteed amount of money. I mean, it wasn't a huge amount, but that didn't pass Congress, but it was, quite a innovative type of piece of legislation. You know, and another person, another example of how far the country has shifted and how corrupt the politics are, and they are indeed, deeply corrupted, is the figure of Dwight David Eisenhower. You know, commander of all Allied forces in Europe in World War II, the head of the D-Day invasion, two-time Republican president of the United States. He said that every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from people, from children who are hungry, from children who do not have enough clothes to wear. And then a few years after he said that, of course, he warned the country of the military-industrial complex. If Eisenhower were alive today, he would have no place in either political party. He'd be considered a kind of renegade outsider who challenged, the militarism and the doctrine of U.S. hegemony in the world. That's another example of how far the country has shifted politically, and I think very ominous. I mean, you all know about that, his farewell address, January 17th, 1961. He warned the country about a military-industrial complex, which was just kind of in formation at that time. The next paragraph, he does tell the American people that there's there's an antidote to this, and that is to get the correct information, to have, to be well educated, to have access to the facts, not the fantasies, not the myths about, the founding finaglers, also known as the founding fathers, and those kinds of things, and that would, sort of address this issue. But if 50 years later, I mean, last year was the 50th anniversary of this speech, you see, again, the absolute grip the Pentagon has on the political economy of the United States. And I'm sure you all are aware of how they very cleverly put in defense contracts in almost every district in the country, so that our so-called representatives in Washington have to vote for this or that weapon system, even though we know that the country doesn't need it. It spends more on the military than all the countries in the world combined. The Pentagon spending accounts for over 50% of the discretionary spending in the federal budget. So if you want to know why there's no money for schools in California, if you want to know why teachers have been working the last 5 years without a pay increase, you can start putting 2 and 2 together and figure out that it's this military-industrial complex and a two-party system that has been supporting it, very vigorously over many, many decades, that is contributing to this kind of situation here at home. Now, I don't want to give Eisenhower a blank check and say, he was this great guy. He is the president who destroyed democracy in Iran, democracy in Guatemala, with huge repercussions, huge blowback from those operations. But nevertheless, I contend if he were alive today, he would not have a seat in either political party. It was Martin Luther King who identified this violence in America, both domestically and, of course, internationally, in his most important address given at Riverside Church in New York on April 4th, 1967. This is not the talk you hear on National Public Radio or other liberal media outlets. The talk you hear on Martin Luther King's birthday is, of course, the wonderful I Have a Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial, which is arguably a great work of poetry. I mean, it is beautiful. The language, the imagery, it's very inspirational and stunning. But 4 years later, he gave a very incisive analysis of what he called the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own country, the United States of America. And he warned the country then. Go back and read the text. You'll see how prophetic it is. He said, if we don't change the growth of militarism and the influence of these corporations, we will be repeating Vietnam's in future decades to come in countries all over the world. Sadly, that of course has happened. He was murdered exactly a year to the day after he gave that speech in Memphis, where it's important to point out he was organizing and working. He was there in solidarity with striking sanitation workers who were holding up signs, "I am a man." He was on his way to Washington to organize a Poor People's March, which terrified the Johnson administration, which was already under tremendous domestic siege from people who were against the wars in Vietnam and in Laos and Cambodia as well. And it was in that Riverside Church speech also that King talked about there comes a time when where silence is betrayal, that we have to speak out. We have to call things by their rightful name. We have to be talking about imperialism and affixing the adjective American before it. We can't pretend that it's simply about the British Empire or the French or the Belgium or the Dutch and these all, the empires of old. The U.S. foreign policy is heavily based on plunder and looting of resources that is buttressed by this military-industrial complex. And for them, of course, it's a big payday. If you're if you're a stockholder or a director of Northrop Grumman or Lockheed Martin or Boeing or United Technologies or General Dynamics or Raytheon or General Electric, any of these military corporations, there is an institutional push and an institutional urge for violence, for conflict, not for peace, not for resolution of conflict through peaceful means and negotiation, but for actual violence. And so there's an enormous tendency to promote conflict. If the Middle East today, which is the site of multiple U.S. bases, the site of enormous dislocation and violence, is also completely surrounded by U.S. Military naval armadas, as well as Air Force bases. The U.S. is openly threatening Iran with war. It's not just Israel. It's the United States of America that is openly threatening Iran. Every time Obama, or whoever's going to be president, says all options are on the table, that's like a mafia don. That's like, the Godfather calling you into your room and putting a gun to your head and saying, all options are on the table. Let's negotiate. But of course, they don't want to negotiate. They keep moving the goalposts. Every time Iran makes some kind of proposal, instead of calling them out on it, instead of saying, okay, show your cards, the U.S. completely ignores it or dismisses it. There was a perfect example of that just a month ago. Over 140 countries of the third world countries, the former Bandung non-aligned movement, met in Tehran. And the Iranian government, I'm no fan of the Iranian government. The Iranian government said the Middle East should be a nuclear-free zone. There should be no weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. Now, what did our greatest newspaper, the one I read every day, incidentally, the New York Times, report on the Iranian proposal? Nada. Nothing. Zilch. There was no coverage of that. There was no information about that. Later, I think, it trickled in through some other sources. But in terms of the major, I would call elite opinion, liberal opinion-making media, All Things Considered, Morning Edition, or Some Things Considered, more accurate. And Morning Edition is actually M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G. Because whenever I hear Cokie Roberts or any of the other pundits, I go into mourning. That's why I wear black, brothers and sisters. It's from listening to too much National Public Radio and watching too much of Charlie Rose and the News Hour, which is better named the Snooze Hour, where they can never find any kind of dissident voice to appear. I mean, it's absolutely stunning. We have lots of very talented and principled people, speakers in this country who have things to say, who can cogently deconstruct the propaganda system and the embedded ideas which that system regurgitates constantly until until it gets into the aquifer, and then everybody's drinking that Kool-Aid and repeating the same things. Iran is a threat. What are we going to do about Iran? So you've already embedded the idea that Iran is a problem. And what are we going to do about it? The assumption being only the United States can do something about a problem. Already there's that colonial imperial arrogance. Daddy knows best for what is good for the rest of the world. And I'm not underestimating the so-called Iranian threat. I was up at Fort Bragg in Mendocino County just a couple of weeks ago, and in broad daylight, Iranian submarines surfaced. Look at the chutzpah of that. No respect for us, flaunting their, many submarines. And then the other day, right off, Santa Monica, there was an Iranian aircraft carrier.
Did they land some tanks on the beach?
When I was driving up Highway 1 to go up to Ventura yesterday, there was Iranian drones right above my car. I mean, it was such a flagrant, shameful, display of their arrogance and power. The pilot was flying so low, I could wave at him and he waved back. Maybe he thought I am Armenian, so maybe he thought I was Iranian. I don't know, but I could read the Farsi on the plane, on the wings of the plane. I mean, I'm glad you're laughing, because it is preposterous. Iran has no submarines. It has no aircraft carriers. The only country on the face of the earth that has an aircraft carrier is the United States of America. Aircraft carrier battle groups. We don't have one, we don't have two, we don't have three. We have 11 aircraft carrier battle groups. And I emphasize battle groups because that's destroyers, cruisers, submarines, minesweepers, the helicopters on the aircraft carriers, the jets on the aircraft carriers, the Marines who are positioned on the aircraft carriers. I mean, this is billions and billions of dollars, going, absolutely down the tubes in order to protect us from putative enemies. And there's a great quote from Joseph Schumpeter. He's not a household name. I guess he's not a household name here. But in some circles, he's a household name. In his own home, he was a household name. I will say that. And Schumpeter was an Austrian sociologist, and I know I'm going to find this quote in just a second. This is always embarrassing. Unfortunately, the teleprompter that I asked for was not available. It's being used elsewhere tonight.
He's stuck in the underground.
It's stuck in the underground, in the bunker. Now, listen to this. And every time you hear the word Rome, just insert the United States or the adjective America. This is written in 1919. There was no corner of the world where some interest was not alleged to be in danger or actual attack. If the interests were not Roman, they were of Rome's allies. And if Rome had no allies, they would be invented. When that became utterly impossible to do, why then it was the national honor that was insulted. The fight was always invested with an aura of legality. Rome was always being attacked by evil-minded neighbors. The whole world was pervaded by a host of enemies, and it was Rome's duty to guard against them and to defend themselves. That is the language of imperialism. It's the language that comes out of almost every statement from the Oval Office or the War Department. It should be called the War Department. It's not defending us. It's carrying out wars around the world on multiple levels. I remember Howard Zinn, our great radical historian, who served in World War II, by the way, as a bombardier. He said that in 1947, when the War Department, the name was changed to Department of Defense, he knew something was up. He knew this was the beginning of the transformation of language becoming vague and opaque, and the use of euphemisms to block understanding. So when the U.S. bombs or invades a country, it doesn't invade a country. It's defending itself. In fact, that country is described as being the belligerent and the bellicose party in any kind of military action. I mean, the record here is so transparent. The documentation is so extensive. But it's like what Orwell says. The thing right in front of your nose is often the hardest thing to see. It's often the hardest thing to perceive. So when I talk to other audiences around the country, and I'm talking about U.S. aggression, U.S. militarism, U.S. imperialism, and I will talk about capitalism in a few minutes, they're blank stares. They've never heard these expressions before. Well, maybe, as Howard Zinn said, he said, well, in 1898, there was a little burst of U.S. imperialism. They attacked and seized Cuba. They seized Puerto Rico, Guam, the Marshall Islands. They seized the Philippines. There was that little moment, but then it was all over. Then the U.S. was the defender of freedom around the world, and particularly since 1945, when the U.S. emerged on the global stage as the world's superpower. A couple of years earlier, in 42, 43, when it already became apparent that the United States was going to win the war, Roosevelt's White House directed the State Department, in tandem with the Council on Foreign Relations, to draw up a kind of a sketch of what the post-war world would look like. This is called Grand Area Planning. You can get all of these documents. And there it's laid out very clearly that the oil reserves of the Middle East, and I'm quoting here from the State Department document, constitute the greatest source of stupendous wealth and strategic power in the history of the world. And the next sentence, kind of implicit, was, and we're going to get it. We're going to push the British and the French out, and that is our oil. And 2 years later, on February 12, 1945, Roosevelt has a very important meeting, which nobody seems to remember or even discuss. He meets with Ibn Saud, the king of Saudi Arabia, on a destroyer in the Suez Canal. He was on his way back from Yalta. This is February 12, 1945, exactly 2 months before he died. He meets with Ibn Saud, and there the deal is sealed. The Faustian bargain is struck that linked the United States with the Saudi kingdom, and in return for defending the Saudi royal family against any external threats, U.S. oil corporations would have access, unlimited access, to that greatest stupendous prize in the history of the world. I point this out because everyone immediately says, "Oh, it's all about Israel." Israel doesn't even exist in 1945. That happens 3 years later. So it's always been, the crucial factor has been about oil and control of oil. The rhetoric, of course, cannot be about that. The rhetoric has to be about human rights, about feminism, about democracy. I mean, again, you have to break out laughing. When you hear Hillary Clinton just a couple of days ago saying the Arab countries need us. They need U.S. democracy. Well, I have news for you, brothers and sisters. U.S. democracy itself is in the ICU. It barely has a pulse. It barely exists. You have a political system in this country which is awash. It's a corporatocracy. It's a plutocracy. These are not my words. I'm talking about a pretty conservative columnist in the New York Times, Maureen Dowd. He said the country is of, by, and for the corporations. That's Maureen Dowd. She's no radical. But it's becoming more and more apparent in terms of what's happening to the beacon of democracy. And I have other breaking news for you, not from Dick Veneer and the Facade newscast, but from myself. They're not that thrilled about American ideas or culture, and they certainly don't want it rammed down their throats. They don't want it coming out of a Hellfire missile or a drone, which is covering now Pakistan. I've been to Pakistan multiple times, and particularly near that border area. And I can tell you, people find that to be a very unpleasant experience. To have their homes bombed, to have their mosques attacked, to have wedding parties blown up, and everyone, of course, is called a militant. Militant and terrorist has replaced communist in the traditional U.S. propaganda system. Before, if you didn't like someone, if they owed you money or they stole your girlfriend or whatever, oh, he's a red. He's a leftist. He's a communist. Today it's the same thing. He's a terrorist. He's a militant. And nobody knows. There's no accounting. We have a chief executive now who is functioning virtually as a godfather, who has a hit list, who meets on Tuesday mornings with his national security advisor and has photographs of people who are alleged to have committed crimes. I don't know if that's true. And they're putting X's and they're all laughing. I mean, again, it's right out of Mario Puzo. I mean, it's right out of, we condemn the mafia for its, brutal behavior and its uncivilized savagery. Well, what's happening here when a president can do that and there's barely a murmur in the liberal press? Imagine if George Bush, who everyone felt virtuous about hating, and indeed he was an execrable person, he was odious in many respects. Imagine if it was Bush that had a hit list, crossing out their photographs every time someone was killed. There would have been an uproar, and rightly so. But we have gone silent. And that silence is betrayal, as Martin Luther King said. And it's important that we speak out in the face of this kind of imperial violence. I was in San Jose on Tuesday, September 11th. I've been going up and down the state of California. I don't have anything else to do, folks. Boulder's kind of dull, so I like to travel. But I picked up the San Jose Mercury News. It was very interesting. The front page, first, your governor said you're not bankrupt, even though school districts are being consolidated, thousands of teachers are being laid off. I was in one class last year at Fresno State University, a class in political science. There were 40 students, okay? 40 students last year. This year I lectured in the same class, 120 students. I said, well, I turned to the professor, who's a friend of mine, I said, well, what's going on here? Oh, we've had to collapse classes. Teachers have been laid off. Those teachers who are still on the payroll have to teach more students. And then she told me something that was really poignant. I almost choked up. She said her greatest fear now is to be in a public place and meet one of her students and not know who it is. Because before, she, with the 40, she pretty much knew who everyone was in the class. If she didn't remember the name, she at least remembered the face. Now that was no longer possible. And, I think that's a shanda. That's a few people might know that Yiddish word. It is a shame. It is a crying shame that this kind of thing is going on. And when Obama accepted the Democratic nomination for a second term in Charlotte, North Carolina, 3 or 4 Thursdays ago, what did he say, among other things? As long as I am Commander-in-Chief of the United States of America, this country will have the most powerful military the world has ever known. I mean, it's a kind of interesting boast. I would think, how about having the United States having the best healthcare system in the world? How about having the best educational system in the world, where from kindergarten to the university level, education is free? How about having the best arts programs in the world so that our filmmakers and cinematographers and playwrights and poets don't have to flip pancakes at IHOP or work at Wendy's making burgers and take on jobs like that, because there's no money for the arts. Why don't we have the best environmental program in the world? Why don't we have the best? Why don't we nurture the environment instead of looting it, plundering it? As is going on in tar sands, in fracking operations all across the country today. Why don't we have, the best in all of these things, why is all the money going into the military, into the war machine, into the imperial war machine? We have 737 bases around the world. Does anybody, even know that? How much money is that costing? Who is paying for that ultimately?
Yeah, we are.
That money is coming out of our hides, out of our pockets, not the 1%. Because the 1% have the lawyers, they have the lobbyists, they have the accountants who can game the system. They know how to work the system. They designed it, which is one of the reasons now I'm talking about the economy here and capitalism, is that we all believe in reforms. Reforms is like some magical potion that you drink after some terrible thing happens, like the greatest economic crash since the Great Depression, the current economic downturn, which is the 17th downturn since the end of World War II. This is the most severe. So, the conventional wisdom, and whenever you hear something that says conventional wisdom, your ears should perk up, because it's the exact opposite of the truth. The conventional wisdom is that if Clinton hadn't repealed the Glass-Steagall Act, none of this would have happened. We would have just been rolling along. And so he did that with the support, of course. Again, this is bipartisan policy. This is not, pounding on the Republicans, although they're a very easy target. But it's also the Democrats, in this case, Clinton repealed the Glass-Steagall Act, which removed the barrier between savings banks and commercial banks, and then put your money, your savings, our savings, into what John Maynard Keynes called the casino economy. So, it's like playing roulette. You're rolling the dice. It may come up sevens. It may come up, twos. Snake eyes. Yeah, exactly. And so now there's a bill in place. Everybody was like, applauding the Dodd-Frank bill. That is sort of the Glass-Steagall reincarnated. But according to Matt Taibbi, who's one of the best journalists in the country, writing in Rolling Stone, and from whatever investigations I've done, the thing is completely full of holes. And it's exactly what Richard Wolff points out in this new book I've done with him, Occupy the Economy. When the wolf is designing the hen house, is he going to make sure that the hen house is absolutely sealed in all parts so that he can't get in? Or is he going to create some space that, when he feels like eating, he's going to be getting into the hen house? That's precisely what goes on in these charades that are called reforms. You have the very people implicated in the crimes, in the chicanery, in the skullduggery, designing the laws. And of course it's full of loopholes. It's been that way since the very beginning. So I just want to, kind of alert you to this illusion, this maya of reform, because it's used as a way to shut people up, to silence dissent. Not only do we have criminalization of dissent in the country, we have this de facto silencing of dissent by, okay, you want reform, we'll give you a bill, now keep quiet, go back home, watch your Law and Order reruns, watch Star Trek, listen to Lawrence Welk, CDs and whatever. And and then when we have the great free press that is supporting all of this, the corporate controlled media, which reinforces all of this kind of it's a weapon of mass distraction. People here, let me say in Southern California, probably know more about the Kardashians, who are outrageously Armenian, than they do about Henry Waxman, or about the Iranian, what the U.S. is doing in the Middle East in terms of ratcheting up the possibility of war. There's more information about Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt. Are they going to stay together? Oh, I don't know. Then there's debates. She may go off with some other guy after a while. Brad's over 40 now. She may be looking, to hedge her bets a little bit. What about Madonna? Is she going to go to Malawi again? Is she going to adopt another baby? This is the stuff, the drivel, the verbiage, the palaver that saturates the media that most people are exposed to. And that I think has produced the kind of consequences we see. We live in a country, the USA, as the great Gore Vidal said, is the United States of amnesia. There's no memory here. Last week is history. Last month is ancient history. And, last year is before the flood. It's antediluvian. And that has very serious consequences. As the great Spanish philosopher George Santayana said, if you don't know the past, you're condemned to repeat it. And we see that over and over again, as King warned in that speech, with U.S. aggression. There's always an enemy out there. Of course, the Soviet Union was a great piñata. For years and years, it was used as a punching bag to justify any kind of U.S. aggression, even destroying democracy in Iran in 1953. It was said by the CIA through their propaganda apparatuses that Mohammad Mossadegh, who was a kind of centrist liberal Democrat, small d, not a radical. Of course, he did have serious problems and flaws, I have to say. He spoke French. Do I have to say anything else? Yeah, Cabernet Sauvignon, Café au lait, Merlot. I rest my case. He studied at the Sorbonne. Clearly, he was exposed to ideas from, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Albert Camus, and other people like that when he was in France. And that must have infected him with these weird ideas. He had a very weird idea. He thought that the oil in Iran should benefit the Iranian people. How weird is that? Right? How weird is that? Instead of, who was controlling the oil then? Well, a little corporation calling itself the Anglo-Iranian Petroleum Company, which later became British Petroleum, which today is BP, the friends who bring you fracking, tar sands extraction, as well as the incredible environmental destruction in the Gulf of Mexico. And so he nationalized the oil. There was a coup. He was overthrown. The Shah is flown back in a CIA plane. This is Operation Ajax. And he's put on the throne. And what were the consequences? Actions do have consequences. You plant seeds, those seeds bear fruit years later. 26 years later, after 26 years of the rule of the autocratic, tyrannical Shah of Iran, the Islamic Revolution happens in Iran. Actions have consequences. Blowback is what the CIA calls it. Same thing in Afghanistan. The U.S., with its great humanitarian allies, the Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, created the Afghan Mujahideen. Well, who did they turn into? Many of them became the Taliban, the very people that were on the U.S. payroll 20 years ago, like Jalaluddin Haqqani and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. I mean, these are major homicidal maniacs. I mean, we're not just talking about, casual killers. These are mass murderers. They were happily supported by the former governor of this state who thought that trees cause pollution, and who also had other great intellectual insights. His name escapes me deliberately.
I'll be back.
Yeah. No. He called these people freedom fighters. He compared them to the founding finaglers. I mean, he must have known something. He even welcomed them into the White House Oval Office. There's a picture on a book. I don't have that book with me this evening that I did with Iqbal Ahmed, a Pakistani activist intellectual, called Terrorism, Theirs and Ours. As far as I know, it is the only publication of this film, this photograph of Reagan in the Oval Office with the CIA officer in charge, John Poindexter, his national security advisor, and the Afghan Mujahideen, the freedom fighters, who of course later were to be revisited in many, many different ways. Now, I have mentioned the founding finaglers. That's Michael Parenti's word. The founding fathers. They're thought of in almost... You can see I'm very organized here. For those of you who don't know, I'm a double Gemini. That will mean something to anyone who knows anything about astrology. Otherwise, just forget I said that. But Geminis tend to be slightly scattered, to say the least. When you mention the founding fathers, of course, you have to, speak those words in hushed tones, because these were not ordinary people. They didn't go to the bathroom the way we go to the bathroom. They didn't put on their clothes the way we put on our clothes. These were gods on earth. They created, this country from nothing. And all the candidates, without exception, down through the years, have tried to somehow link themselves, hook themselves up with the founding fathers. I was in Eugene during what can only be described as one of the greatest outbursts of intellectual activity, the Republican primaries, where people were saying rather amazing things, from Newt Gingrich to Romney, and I've forgotten the others. Anyway, I picked up a pamphlet here with Ron Paul. I'll hold it close to the microphone since this is being recorded for radio, getting a good shot of that. And there's, this is typical. I'm not picking on Ron Paul. He's looking very resolutely into the future. He's full of determination and resolve. And underneath him, it's hard to see, there are the founding fathers, the gods that we all worship, Jefferson, Adams, Washington, Hamilton, and the rest. Well, I think it's important to, kind of deconstruct the myths of the founding of the country to understand where we are today. This is not about picking on the U.S. Every country has mythology about itself. So the U.S. is no different. The past is often invented, whole cloth in some circumstances. And so, as Chomsky points out in this book, How the World Works, a very modest title, only Chomsky could come up with a title like this. He talks about a couple of these founding fathers and what they said. Let's take first and foremost James Madison, who's regarded again as a god who strode the earth. Two-time president. He wrote most of the Constitution. He wrote most of the Federalist Papers. Hamilton wrote a few, but it was mostly Madison who wrote the Federalist Papers. Well, what did he say was the aim of government? Okay, what was the aim of government? In his very words, the aim of government is to protect the opulent minority against the majority. The aim of government is to protect the opulent minority against the majority. Now, his friend and colleague, John Jay, was not so subtle. He came out with it in a little more blatant terms. John Jay was the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, first President of the Constitutional Convention. He said, point blank, those that own the country ought to run it. Now, if that's not a description and a prescription for 1% versus the 99%, at least politically, I don't know what is. And there it is. I mean, it starts from the very beginning, the embedded inequality, that there was a ruling class, and yes, we have classes in this country. It's a taboo word, like imperialism, like capitalism. You can't talk about imperialism. You talk about U.S. foreign policy. Of course, well, U.S. foreign policy. Mistakes were made. Vietnam was a mistake. Bombing Cambodia was a mistake. Killing 1 million Laotians was a mistake. Invading Panama was a mistake. It's always the myth of good, benign intent and good intentions. It's always used. All the language is just replete with euphemisms. That would have Orwell flipping in his grave. And so, trying to get, to the core of this, the capitalist economic system has been, of course, very, very difficult. Of course, really existing capitalism is not taught at USC or UCLA or Cal or the University of Colorado at Boulder or at Harvard or at Princeton or Yale. The capitalism that they're teaching is the fantasy capitalism, where there's the marketplace, there's entrepreneurs, we compete. If I make money, I generate more income for myself. If you are bad business, you don't know how to conduct business, you go out of business, good luck. That's not the way it works for the big boys, for the 1%. The 1% are covered. They are subsidized. There's massive amounts of money being transferred from us, up. You remember when they said, again, I mentioned his name, the former governor of California, he said a rising tide lifts all boats. That was one of his famous slogans. Well, yeah, the rising tide does lift some boats. Which ones? The yachts. The other boats that we're in, the canoes, the kayaks, the rowboats, we're going right down to the bottom. But of course, you can't say that. Just as you can't say you're invading a country for its oil or for its iron ore or its bauxite or copper or tin or coal. You can't. That won't wash. It has to be something sublime, something lofty. Something that we can worship. In fact, there's the best description of imperialism is in Joseph Conrad's novel Heart of Darkness. I urge you all to read it. There's a passage in there where he talks about this very thing, having seen Belgian imperialism absolutely destroy Central Africa and the Congo. He says the thing that justified everything was some lofty idea which everyone could worship, like the white man's burden, like the British Empire, like the Queen, like Western civilization. Well, as Gandhi, was once asked about Western civilization, what he thought about it, he said, it'd be a good idea. So, look at Conrad. In fact, in fiction, you can learn a lot about reality. Look at Graham Greene's Quiet American, if you want to see that hubris, the arrogance of the well-meaning American, in this case, Alden Pyle. And there was a fairly decent film made of this as well. And there's many, many other examples. Moby Dick I talk about all the time. I mean, not only is it the great American novel, it is also about the American empire. It's also about the destruction of nature itself. The white whale is the embodiment of nature, of purity. And the Ahab, of course, is the out-of-control imperial war machine. And the people on the crew of the Pequod. And Melville, he created a kind of a very multiracial, multinational crew. I mean, for the mid-1850s. I mean, this was very interesting. The crew, we are the crew. The people in the country going along for the ride, led by a demonic captain who has only one thing driving him, the destruction of Moby Dick. That, in a kind of rough way, is what we are doing to the environment. So when people tell me, and there's smart people out there like Amory Lovins, Paul Hawken, and many others. They talk about a natural capitalism. That we can just tinker with the system a little bit, and it will somehow revitalize itself and be kind and gentle. It's not going to happen, brothers and sisters. If you believe that pigs fly, then you might believe that there can be such a thing. But capitalism in its DNA, as Wolf talks about here, it is a systemic problem. It is about its structural imperatives that drive it to loot, to plunder. Of course, they don't use those words. It's all about development. We want to develop, this or that country. We want to, we want to partner. Another obscene word. Every time I hear it, we're partnering with our, Iraqi allies after, stomping them to death. We want to partner with our Afghan friends. After, raping Afghanistan and being responsible for so much death and destruction there. So, all of these things, how the use of language comes into play to control the public mind. This is done consciously, brothers and sisters. This is not like, oh, let's just write this up. They know the language. They know how to use the vocabulary in order to prevent thought. There's a line in 1984 where Orwell kind of said that's the function of newspeak, is to prevent critical thinking. And so your mind just wanders into daydreaming about things of no consequence whatsoever. So I think, talking about the origins of the country and where we are today, where basically corporations rule, they are calling most of the shots. Money is apparently free speech. I didn't know. I guess I'm going to take this out. This money's talking. And in a way, yeah, money does not only talks, it swears, as Bob Dylan used to say. So this is free speech. And it's all another line of propaganda. Level playing field. All right, so you got 20 bucks. Why don't you compete with Bill Gates? Why don't you compete with Donald Trump? It's a level playing field. You bring your money to the table. Trump brings his money to the table, and you got a level playing field. The field is upside down, brothers and sisters. There is no such thing as a level playing field. In fact, there's no such thing as capitalism as it actually exists, because as it's actually being conducted, because it is so dependent on public subsidies. It is, you know, all of the arms exports, and the U.S. is the #1 exporter of weapons around the world. I mean, that's something to be ashamed of, in my view. I wish we were the #1 exporter of drama and dance troupes and film and poetry rather than weapons. But yeah, this is the realm, the coin of the realm is weapons. And so the big military contractors, and you have some of them here in Southern California, you know, many of them, Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman, for example, they are making money hand over fist. And then, of course, the apologists for the system will say, well, they provide jobs. Yeah, well, this is another myth. You know, this is another thing, another shibboleth that should just be blown out of the water. The fact of the matter is, and there have been many studies conducted about this, very highly documented studies that prove beyond any doubt that weapons manufacturing is capital intensive. It's not labor intensive. It's not providing a lot of jobs. Many more jobs could be provided in building a decent public rail network in this country, you know, in restoring the environment, in building, as was done in the 1930s during the New Deal, parks, trails. You know, many of the trails I go on in Colorado were constructed in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps, one of the major pieces of FDR's New Deal. There's so much work to be done. Here's a kind of punchline and a soundbite. There's so much work to be done. There are millions of people without work. What does it tell you about a system that cannot bring all of these people out of work, about 25 million that we know about? There are many more who have just fallen through the cracks. They've given up. So they're not even enumerated. They're not even counted in the unemployed. You know, and if you work part-time, even though you want a full-time job, you're considered, employed. There are all of these people out of work. There's all of this work that needs to be done. And what does it tell you about a system that cannot bring these two things together? It tells you that the capitalist system is in serious crisis. It is inherently unstable. In its DNA, it has to destroy the environment. That is to say, it is destroying us, because we cannot live without our dear Mother Earth. If we destroy it, there will be no life as we know it today, because capitalism is driven by profits über alles. That's what it's about. You know, there's a New Yorker cartoon that came out a couple of months ago. It kind of illustrates this. There's a meeting of stockholders. You know, it's in some New York hotel, and there's let's say I'm the CEO. I'm standing in front of you, and I've got my charts here. You know, arrows are pointing up. You know, and arrows are pointing down. Who knows what they mean? And you know, the stockholders in the audience, they're getting a little antsy. You know, we haven't seen many dividends lately. You know, what's going on here, Barsamian? You're supposed to be so smart. We're paying you $800 million, for Christ's sake. You know, where are our dividends? And I say, you know, calm down, ladies and gentlemen. And then I give you the wrap. And the wrap is, in the long term, the planet is doomed. Sorry, it looks absolutely dreadful. There's going to be widespread famine, starvation, there'll be wars, destruction. But, and then he perks up, in the short term, there's never been a rosier time to make profits. And all the stockholders jump to their feet and give me a standing ovation. And that, in its essence, is what the system is about. It cannot help itself. It's like, I hope none of you have a tumor at any time in your life. But what does the tumor do? It metastasizes. It eats its host. It's not because it hates its host or, you know, would rather be watching cable TV or, you know, whatever. You know, it doesn't have a choice. It has to multiply and ultimately will consume the thing that is giving its life. And that's what the capitalist economic system is. So we've got to be thinking about alternatives in a very creative and dynamic way right now, because time is not on our side. If you're reading these reports, and I think now the documentation is voluminous. It's enormous. There's no question about what's happening with climate change. There's no question about what's happening with fresh water. Water itself will be the source of major conflicts to come in the coming decades. This is not my prediction. I mean, I think it's fairly obvious that it will be. But Ismail Sarageldin, who is a vice president of the World Bank, I think he's from Malaysia, in the late 90s said that in the past, wars were about ivory and gold and silver, and right now it's about oil. He's talking in and right now, of course, it is about oil. But in the future, he said, water will be the source of major conflict. Now, I live in a water-stressed state, Colorado, and I travel to New Mexico a lot and surrounding areas, and we're already seeing, again, I'm not a scientist. I live in Boulder, Colorado. I can see glaciers from my window. Those glaciers are significantly smaller than they were 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago. I hike up into those mountains. You can see it with your own eyes. You don't have to measure anything. You don't need equipment to see what's going on. And this is being repeated all over the world. I've been in the Himalayan Kashmir. I've been in Pakistan. I've been in Nepal. The same thing. I'm talking to people there. Oh, there used to be this enormous glacier here, the size of Topanga Canyon, and now it's completely reduced to a few square feet. I mean, this has happened again right in front of these people. So, we need to be, the whole attitude toward nature from the very beginning has been one of avarice and aggression. Nature is something to be conquered. It is wild. It is savage. It has to be contained. It has to be tamed. I mean, there's some kind of misogynistic element that is running through this, because it's very much like women are out of control, right? They're wild, they're emotional, and nature is like that. And we have to tame nature. So this goes back to John Winthrop, to again, before the founding fathers. I'm talking now about Plymouth Rock, and that crew that came over then. They were, again, talking about nature. What is their argument? If God didn't want us to plunder those resources, He would not have put them there for us. And that is a radical American Taliban Christianity today. In promoting fracking, in promoting drill baby drill, and the tar sands project in northern Alberta, which is described, and I think it's accurate. I was in Edmonton in April, I think it was, the most destructive environmental project in the history of the world. And enormous amounts of fresh water are being used to separate the oil from the tar sands. This sticky molasses kind of substance, which is called bitumen, I think it is. And so you see the roots of that, and how capitalism has adopted itself to this kind of theological view of nature. Something out there to be milked, something out there to extract profits from, something to generate income. And speaking of income, and it's a topic that Wolf talks about in this book. There's one of the good things that Occupy did many good things, was to inject this term income inequality into the political discourse. I mean, even Romney and Obama have to talk about income inequality. One thing they don't talk about is wealth inequality. Now, income inequality is pretty straightforward. You earn $30,000, I earn $20,000. That's how much you take home, that's how much I take. So that's income inequality. But then it turns out our dear friend here in the first row has a private jet, has a private pilot, has a chalet in Aspen, has penthouses in New York, has an apartment on the Champs-Élysées in Paris. She has hedge funds, she has private equity funds, she owns stocks, she owns bonds. Should I keep going? So, so her wealth is off the charts. It's in the stratosphere. And I have zero wealth. I've got a few bucks in an IRA, depending on Social Security. That's my wealth. I don't have those other things. And so that's another area where you have just seen an enormous change in the political equilibrium, if you will, of the country. And a lot of this, started, a lot of the trends that we see today that have become so grotesque and so manifest really started in the 1980s, late 1970s. That's when wages went flat. That for the first time in American history, workers' wages became stagnant. The American workers were constantly used to, for over 150 years, constantly rising wages, they went flat. Unions had been destroyed. At a point where unions were 37% of the workers in the country were unionized. There was organized attacks against workers, against unions. What was the governor of California's first act as president of the United States? Destroy a union, break the air traffic controllers union. The very same air traffic controllers union that I learned in Fresno a couple of weeks ago had endorsed Reagan for election in 1980. Yeah. So you see this, and what did the AFL-CIO do at the time? It did nothing. There wasn't a pip, there wasn't a squeak from organized labor. Lane Kirkland, who's arguably one of the worst presidents of organized labor in the history of this country, of the AFL-CIO. He was more interested in bringing democracy to workers in Poland than to workers here in the United States. He wanted economic justice for Polish workers because it fit into the Reagan anti-communist propaganda model that he embraced, than for economic justice here at home. Economic justice should be part and parcel of any kind of change in this country. We need to inject that term into the political discourse the way FDR did in his 1944 State of the Union address. Again, if you look at it today, it's a radical document. He would have no place in the Democratic Party, much less the Republican Party, because of his radical views that people had a right to fair and affordable housing, that people had a right to job, that people had a right to health care. These are radical ideas today. We are screaming for them, but no one is listening because many of the 535, so-called representatives of the people in Congress have basically been bought by corporations. There's a few honorable exceptions, but that's how it goes. So about some of the things, and speaking of FDR, let me not forget to quote his Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, who said you can have great concentrations of wealth or you can have democracy, but you can't have both. And right now, that imbalance has become so acute in the United States. We see how democracy is in the ICU. There's still a pulse. We're not ready to count it out, but it is in very fragile condition. It is in very, very deep peril. And then you have, of course, the Supreme Court decision of January 2010, Citizens United, which, by the way, was not a revolutionary kind of decision. There's been a pattern of Supreme Court decisions since the 1880s that have empowered corporations, that have disempowered citizens in this country. But this one, of course, was particularly egregious because it openly declared that money is free speech and corporations are people, and that this has opened the floodgates, as we've seen now in this $2 billion plus presidential campaign, where you can give money secretly to these political action committees, these PACs, and people like Sheldon Adelson and the Koch brothers and others are just, they're just opening the spigots. It's a great moment for them in terms of influencing politics. So we need public financing of elections. We need elections not on Tuesday, a workers' day. Or if you want it on Tuesday, if you're so wed to Tuesdays, okay, declare it a national holiday. But it's very difficult for a lot of people to work. I know a lot of people in Boulder, who work in Denver, leave early in the morning so they can't get to the polls. Polls open at 7, they're driving at 6. Coming back, they're stuck in a traffic jam. They don't get back home until after the polls close. They can't get to vote. I mean, that's completely nutty. The way each state has different voting requirements. There should be universal standards across the country. And I think, that's absolutely essential. The Electoral College is another farce that should be totally abolished. It is intrinsically anti-democratic. What do I mean by that? If I carry 10 states, right? Texas, California, Illinois, right? I win the election because I've commanded a majority in the Electoral College. But our sister here actually got 10 million more votes than I did. But she, she carried Delaware, Connecticut, New Jersey. It doesn't matter. I win the election. That seems to be a nutty system that should be abolished immediately. But then, of course, there's the whole issue of candidates and the political parties. As Jim Hightower said, if the goddess wanted us to vote, she would have given us candidates. And so, we have to address that issue at all. But those could be some changes in the system. Now, I've been given a heads up here to kind of wind it up. I do want to talk about some of the alternatives that are now surfacing around the country in terms of creating structures that could ultimately replace the current existing system of capitalism. And this isn't going to happen overnight. This is a deeply entrenched economic system that is supported overwhelmingly by the two political parties that dominate Washington and the state houses. And so this is going to take a lot of time. But we see a huge growth in co-ops, tens of thousands of them all over the country, worker-owned cooperatives. I was walking on Valencia Street in the Mission in San Francisco just 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I look up, it's a coffee house, I'm a coffee addict, and I see underneath the name of the coffee house, worker-owned and operated.
Wow.
Oh, wow. Then I heard about a guy named John Curl in the East Bay. Turns out he's a carpenter. He's organized other building tradespeople, masons, furniture makers, and others, roofers, into a workers' cooperative in the East Bay. And this is repeating itself all around the country. There's there's this alternative currencies in Western Massachusetts, in Ithaca, New York, and other places that are taking hold. There's a huge farmers markets and community service supported agriculture, CSAs, which provide an alternative to Cargill and Monsanto and Archer Daniels Midland produced, GMO-laden, additive-laden, carcinogenic food that is presented up to many, many people. So there's been a huge growth in credit unions. I mean, this is a big story. I mean, okay, they're banks, but at least the banks are in your community. And when you go to see the banker, you say, "Oh yeah, didn't my son go to school with your daughter? Didn't I see you in the synagogue last week? Don't you go to this church?" There's some connection. There are local people there. It's likely that you can get a loan from people that you know, rather than someone representing Wells Fargo or Bank of America or J.P. Morgan Chase or Citicorp. The four remaining big banks that that are still standing. Billions of dollars have been transferred from those banks, and believe me, they've felt it, into these local credit unions all around the country. So that's a very positive development as well. And we have to rehabilitate the word socialism. Maybe we need to create another word, because for 70 years this word has been dragged into the mud, disparaged, ridiculed. As soon as you say it, what's the response? Like I often get, and I have an 800 number, so people feel very comfortable to call and abuse me. Go back to. Why don't you go back to Russia? If you don't like it here so much, I'm not Russian. I don't speak Russian. I don't know anybody there. Why should I go back to Russia? But, and so the first thing they say when you have a critique of the system, when you're talking about U.S. imperialism or the predatory nature of corporate capitalism, they say, oh, you want Stalin. You want gulags. You want Siberia. You want death camps. That's what you want. See, because of brainwashing for 70, 80 years, that's how socialism has been tarnished. Now, Lenin was no idiot. At the time that the Soviet Union formed, the word socialist and socialism had enormous prestige all around the world. I mean, it was a great force for progress and social and economic justice. So he decided, I'm going to co-opt this word, put it into the title of the Soviet Union, so it became the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And it was, again, it was a lexical coup. Because, Soviet Union, because socialism had such prestige at that time. Eugene Victor Debs, who Woodrow Wilson, the great liberal president and former head of Princeton University, who put Debs in jail in 1916 and 1920 because Debs opposed World War I. Eugene Debs got 1 million votes when he was in jail in 1920. I mean, there was no internet. He wasn't texting. He wasn't, he wasn't making cell phone calls. He wasn't, making TV ads. How did he get 1 million votes? I mean, I think that's amazing. And around this time, Appeal to Reason, published not in New York, not in Berkeley, not in Santa Monica, but in Kansas, had 700,000 paid subscribers. It was an openly socialist newspaper, and it was read by over 4 million people. I mean, that's the history of socialism here in the United States. And so, of course, it got tarnished. So we need to rehabilitate that or come up with some more creative word, maybe cooperative. People can get behind that, worker-owned cooperative society, humanitarian, instead of humanitarian, humanitarian. So that's another thing that needs to be done. Okay, I know I have to wind up. One of the things that's so important about meetings like this, not because I'm here, is because you see other people, you see kindred spirits. Somebody earlier said, oh, you'll be talking to the converted tonight. I don't mind talking to the converted. I don't know if that's the case, but I think the converted need solidarity. The converted need to know that they're not, they're not weird. They're not strange for having these ideas that there's something seriously wrong with this economic system and a foreign policy that is based on aggression and domination and hegemony. So, I'm happy to be here, but I'm leaving in the morning, and it's what you do here in this community, how you organize things, what next steps the Peace Coalition can take, the Green Party can take, I forget the third component. Progressive Democrats can take. That's for you to decide. But coming together is very, very important. And there's a wonderful poem that Marge Piercy wrote from her collection, The Moon is Always Female. And I'd like to read a couple of paragraphs to you because it really speaks to this need for solidarity and community and cooperation. What can they do to you? Whatever they want. They can set you up, they can bust you, they can break your fingers, they can blur you with drugs till you can't walk, can't remember. They can do anything they want. You can't stop them. You're all alone. Alone you can fight, you can refuse, you can take what revenge you can, but eventually they'll just roll over you. But two people fighting back to back can cut through a mob. Two people can keep each other sane, can give support, conviction, love, hope, massage, sex. Three people are a delegation, a committee. With four, you can play bridge. With six, you can rent a whole house, eat pie for dinner with no seconds. And hold a fundraising party. A dozen fill a hall. 100 make a demonstration. It goes on one at a time. It starts when you care to act. It starts when you do it again. And they said no. It starts when you say we and know who you mean, and each day you mean one more. Marge Piercy. Now I'm going to jump to a part of the world that I've been very closely connected to, South Asia. I was deported from India on September 23rd last year. I've been going to that country since 1966, studied music there, and have lots of dear friends and deeply immersed myself in Indian culture. But my deportation had to do with my work on Kashmir, which Hindu nationalists are very, very sensitive about, almost in a way that I would say maybe some extreme supporters of Israel respond to any critique of Israel. And so for Hindu nationalists, Kashmir is that third rail. It just agitates them, and because I've been talking about the atrocities that the Indian state has committed in Kashmir and giving a lot of publicity to that, I was deported last year. But, and I hope to get back at some point, for sure. One of the great traditions in South Asia, by that I mean Pakistan, and India, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, is poetry. Now, I live in Boulder, Colorado. Some of you may know there's Naropa University there. A great poetry institute was established by Allen Ginsberg. Anne Waldman is still there. People like, when they were alive, Lawrence Ferlinghetti is still alive. He's coming. Amiri Baraka was just there. You know, a lot of the beats from the 50s and 60s sort of made Boulder their home and had poetry readings. And so we'd go to these poetry readings, and 50, 55, 60 people would show up, and they were just tickled pink. And, wow, look at the support for poetry here. You know, people are really into supporting the arts and poets and the like. Well, then I thought, you know, you go to South Asia. I've been to poetry readings where there have been 200,000 people turning out, you know, and cheering the poets like they're rock stars, sitting on rough carpets called duddy, and having a tent overhead maybe, and very knowledgeable about the poetry. You know, if the poet would say the first line, they would repeat the second line before the poet could say it. There's that kind of knowledge and awareness. It's an oral tradition, you know, and it's very rich. Well, one of the greatest Urdu poets is Faiz Ahmed Faiz. F-A-I-Z. It's kind of unusual. His first name and his last name is the same, Faiz. It means kindness, mercy, benevolence in Arabic and in Persian and in Urdu as well. Urdu is the national language of Pakistan. It's spoken in Kashmir as well as in North India. Faiz was its greatest poet. He was a journalist and proud of it. He was a Red and proud of it. He was a Union man and proud of it. He served in jails that were supported by US-supported dictators like Ayub Khan. He was sentenced to prison and served many years in jail there because of his political beliefs. Well, his most, I got it, faster. I'm speeding up now. His most famous poem is called Bol, B-O-L. Now you know a word in Hindi and in Urdu. Millions of people will respond to you if you say Bol. It's the imperative for speak. Speak. So this is his poem, the famous poem. When you go to political demonstrations in India, in the Hindi script, they write it out, Bol. And in Pakistan, when you go to political demonstrations, it's in the Arabic Persian script, Bol. It's the exact same word. Bol ke lab azad hai tere, bol zaban ab tak teri hai. Bol, speak. Your lips are free. Speak, your tongue is still yours. This magnificent body is still yours. Speak, there is little time, but little though it is, there is enough time. Enough before the body perishes, before the tongue atrophies. Speak, the truth still lives. Say what you have to say. Speak, your lips are free. Bol, Faiz Ahmed Faiz. Now, staying in, you know, I like to inject poetry and art into political discussions, and you noticed at the beginning there was all that humor too, because I think it goes to a different part of the brain, you know, that needs a separate kind of nurturing from just facts and figures. Yes, we've got to know our facts and figures, but we should have a good time along the way too. We should eat well, we should, you know, make good movies, see good plays, act in them, read good poetry. All of this is absolutely crucial so that, you know, we can breathe, so that we have a more complete and rich existence. But staying in South Asia, I want to mention to you one of the bravest women that I know in the world and one of the most talented, Arundhati Roy. She is just, I think today, there is no one writing in the English language with greater precision and with greater insight than Roy in terms of political essays. I've done many programs with her. I've done a book with her. She's incredibly courageous as well, because the Hindu nationalists hate her. Because she speaks about Kashmir. She speaks about the 70,000 Kashmiris that have been killed, the 10,000 who have been disappeared, the hundreds of thousands who have been tortured, who have been kept in Indian detention centers all over Kashmir. So her house has been attacked. Meetings that she goes to where she speaks have been disrupted by the same kind of things that we hear here. Oh, you're anti-Indian. You hate your country. Why don't you go and marry a Muslim in Kashmir? You seem to have so much affection for them. Anyway, Arundhati Roy. She wrote this in 2002. Fortunately, power has a shelf life. When the time comes, maybe this mighty empire will, like others before it, overreach itself and implode from within. It looks as though structural cracks have already appeared. 2002. The war against terror casts its net wider and wider. America's corporate heart is hemorrhaging. For all the endless empty chatter about democracy, how can you have democracy that's controlled by greedy bankers and CEOs who nobody elected? The time has come, the walrus said. Perhaps things will get worse and then better. Perhaps there's a small God up in heaven readying herself for us. Another world is not only possible, she's on her way. Maybe many of us won't be here to greet her, but on a quiet day, if I listen very carefully, I can hear her breathing. Finally, that's an applause line. This is really fun. Woo! Usually there's a gasp. God, what is this guy? Who does he think he is? Some smart-ass New Yorker, Woody Allen look-alike, or what? We're going to close with one of the great cultural figures this country has ever produced, Gil Scott-Heron. The progenitor of rap and hip-hop. I mean, you talk about someone before his time. He's writing in the 1970s, what people are talking about today. A great artist. So I think, perhaps his most, and I'm doing radio, so maybe his most famous program song is "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." Well, as a radio editor and journalist, I take some liberties with updating the verse a little bit. And this is, of course, to Night in Tunisia. The revolution will not be televised. You'll not be able to stay home, brothers and sisters. You'll not be able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. You'll not be able to lose yourself on Star Trek reruns, skip out for beer during commercials, because the revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by J.P. Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Citicorp, and Bank of America in 4 parts without commercial interruption. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by CBS, PBS, MSNBC, CNN, NPR, or ABC, and will not star Julia Roberts and Tom Hanks. The revolution will not give your mouth sex appeal. The revolution will not get rid of zits. The revolution will not make you look 5 pounds lighter. The revolution will not be televised, brothers and sisters. You'll not be able to worry. You won't have to worry about iPhones, iPads, iMacs, iClouds, or iPods. And the revolutionary song will not be sung by Justin Bieber or Lady Gaga. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be right back after a message about a whiteout, a white tornado, white chocolate, white lightning, or white people. You'll not have to worry about a dove in your bedroom. The revolution will not go better with Coke, Pepsi, Diet 7-Up, or Sprite. The revolution will not fight the germs that may cause bad breath. The revolution will put you in the driver's seat. The revolution will not be televised, not be televised. There'll be no rerun, brothers and sisters. It will be live on alternative radio. Thank you very much.